Welcome to our next AIB webinar featuring the latest research from our two journals, Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Policy. My name is Klaus Meyer and I'm your host today. I'm sorry, I'm getting some very confusing messages in the chat, but let's get going. As most of you know, we are organizing this seminar series as a forum for sharing research that has recently been published, and we want to explore how the recent research influences current thinking and future research. As usual, my thanks go to the people who make this happen, which is, of course, the journal editors, along with the support staff, especially at the AIB office, Tunga Kiak, and in Manchester, specifically supporting us on the technical side, Renfei Gao. The idea here is that we have recently published paper. In fact, today we have 3 papers that are still in advance online. So you can get them on the website if you click on the papers that are in press right now. Since we want to have this as a discussion forum, you all, 101 participants, what a wonderful number, you all have the chance to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to do that. Our moderator, Saul Estrin, will pick up questions from there and ask the panelists. You also have the chance to vote on questions. So if you see someone else ask a question that you think is interesting, you like that question, and that means it goes further up in the ranking, which means the moderator is more likely to see it. I would like to dedicate today's webinar to Professor Mike Wright, who sadly passed away almost exactly a year ago. Mike has been a significant contributor to the research on state-owned enterprises. In fact, he has been a significant contributor to many areas of business and management research. One of the most cited and most prolific authors in our field, and in fact, a co-author on one of the papers today, and a friend of co-authors to others who are participating in today's event. Today's topic on state ownership and innovation is, from a personal view, I think is a very interesting one, because where I come from is sort of the debate on economic transition in the 1990s, when we were discussing how can we reform the transition economies in Eastern Europe, and why did socialism fail in the first place? And the key issue is in that debate was that basically state enterprises cannot innovate. That was sort of the received wisdom, the synthesis of that discussion. And I've put here a paper by Bruce Kogut and Ugo Sander that influenced my thinking on that issue. But there were other people who came up with that argument. So when I read through the advance online recently, and I saw 3 papers that are basically arguing the opposite, that state-owned enterprises can innovate under some conditions, under some, if appropriately incentivized, or whatever specific issues are right, but state enterprises can be innovation leaders. So I thought that's an interesting question because it sort of challenges the received wisdom. And so that's why I then put this webinar together to co-moderate the session today with me. I have Saul Estrin from the London School of Economics, co-author of mine, as many of you know, but also more importantly, a contributor on the discussion on state ownership, both in the 1990s on Eastern Europe, but also in recent publications around in a variety of different outlets. With that introduction, over to you, Saul.
Well, thanks very much, Klaus, and welcome to all of you, however many we are now, 111 and rising. I think we have a very exciting and stimulating panel here. As Klaus has sort of intimated, in a way, this is a rather surprising set of research questions for me. I also worked, going back a long time, with Mike Wright. Our first work together was actually about state ownership in Russia, where we edited a special issue and wrote a paper around that. And what's very interesting, because I reread our foreword and our paper, and there's no mention of any innovation in that. And the reason for that is very simple. It didn't really occur to us there would be any state innovation in state-owned firms. And that was the whole failure that led to collapse of the communist system, we thought, was a failure of this sort of organization to innovate. So here we are, back with a new set of questions, using new data sets and looking at new countries. And I thought I'd just kick the ball off by asking why things have changed so much. And to do that, we need to see that there were three broad reasons, I think, why people thought that state-owned firms would be inefficient and why they wouldn't innovate. The first was related to the idea that they had multiple objectives, or they had political objectives as well as economic objectives. And that led to much less pressure to innovate. And I did some work on that. A second, much better known line of argument is essentially that we're going to hear all the papers to some extent. We'll talk about this is the standard agency issues, deriving initially, I think, from the work of John Vickers and his colleagues in Oxford. And essentially arguing that the state as owner finds it very hard to replicate the governance mechanisms of private owners, and that allows managers to exploit the resources to satisfy their own objectives rather than the objectives of the state as an owner. And that leads there to be less resources and less desire to innovate. And then the third set of reasons, which I don't need to extend upon because Klaus has mentioned, is the sort of line of argument brought out by Kogert and Zander related to the degree of risk aversion and antipathy to innovation in state-owned organizations. So there seems to be really a lot of reasons why you'd expect state-owned firms wouldn't innovate. Why have things changed? Why are we looking at this differently? Well, actually, Mike Wright led the way a bit on this with his work with others about the whole idea that state ownership itself was a very complicated notion, right? In the Soviet era, all firms were just state-owned. In Russia, there weren't any private firms, but now, of course, we have state-owned firms that are essentially hybrid organizations that are quoted on stock exchanges. Some are commercialized. Aurora will be talking about this. Some are actually privatized or semi-privatized, and so the notion of state ownership has evolved in recent years, and that, of course, does begin to address a lot of these agency problems. At the same time, I think the political economy idea has changed. We've got this idea now of the development state, the idea the state may bring resources to bear to lead the economy to grow, to develop, and to use firms, especially the firms that it owns, as the organizing fulcrums for that development strategy. And then lastly, of course, you've got the whole resource question of the agglomeration of resources by the state through subsidies or soft loans or transfer pricing that can assist. So we've got lots of reasons now to think once again about whether the state can innovate. I may also add that the idea of how effective the state is as an owner is very much influenced by the institutional arrangements. Klaus and I and others have done a paper on this, and as have many other people. And it's interesting to see that several of the papers this afternoon pick up these moderating effects and try to get some sort of boundary conditions on the relationship between state ownership and innovation. Well, you've heard enough from me. I just wanted to try and set up the sort of issues that bind these papers together and hopefully will therefore guide us through the questions. We have three presentations. We're starting today with Sergio Lazzarini. He's going to talk about, he's going to use a very interesting piece of work. He's going to use a matched data sample, something that everyone's been calling for 30 years, but almost no one has ever done, to actually ask the question, well, do they actually innovate more or less? Over to you, Sergio. You're muted.
Muted, sorry. Now, okay, so thank you so much, Saul, Klaus, everybody. I mean, it's It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the participants and all my colleagues here in the panel. So, as Saul mentioned, I'm going to talk about innovation of state-owned firms. Sharing my screen, hope that you're seeing it. So this is joint work with Luis Mesquita, Felipe Monteiro, and Aldo Musacchio. So basically our idea was to examine, state-owned enterprises that compete on markets, basically. So we have Renault, for instance, has a minority shares of governments in the aerospace industry. You have examples like Airbus and Brazil's Embraer used to be a state-owned enterprise majority controlled. Now it's minority. And even claims that the state is what drives those, or is at the root of major innovations, like this book by Mariana Mazzucato. And and that's all said. I mean, and Klaus, this is kind of a difficult thing to grasp, because we all know that SOEs have so many inefficiencies, agency problems, etc. I mean, how come they can be innovative? So, and it's true. I mean, we all know that SOEs have all those agency problems due to poor incentives, political influence, etc., etc., etc. We all know this. This is very well studied. However, our argument here is that perhaps some of those things that create traditional agency problems may be a positive aspect in a sense, because they're going to create or bring some sort of managerial autonomy for managers to escape the short-term pressure of traditional capital markets, so they can experiment more. Also, there are recent studies arguing that more patient investors will be able to allow for higher risk taking. All those things will facilitate innovation, we argue. And furthermore, state-owned enterprises are embedded in an environment where governments will promote what the so-called industrial policies. So they will receive subsidies, all types of things that will help promote innovation. So in a nutshell, no time to discuss this here in detail. So this is our model. We're arguing that state ownership will affect three types of invention outcomes. First, a positive effect on invention pioneerism, basically measured as patents. We're using patents, patents that do not cite any previous patent. I mean, it's this idea that it's a new thing. And the idea again, I mean, to develop those new things, you need to have some autonomy, more patience from your investors, etc., right? Also, we argue that this autonomy will increase the frequency of inventions, number of patents. However, and that's the downside, we argue, I mean, perhaps some those state-owned enterprises will have a lot of patents, but those patents will not be that impactful compared to private firms. Impactful in terms of citations, right? As is usual in this literature. Moderating effects, we argue that those potential positive effects are undermined, are reduced if you are in a context of weak political constraints. The idea is that if the economy doesn't have many veto points, meaning that the government can intervene, grab resources from SOEs, then all those positive effects essentially disappear. However, even when you are in a kind of low quality institutional environment, along those lines, if you are in a sector with high invention productivity, which we measure based on citation-weighted patents per employee, industries where you need to be productive with many inventions, then you may be in a weak environment, but this factor will compensate for that. I mean, the governments will not mess with state-owned enterprises in more productive industries. So this is an interaction between industry level and sector level, country level and sector level factors. So data methods, real quick. We have a matched sample of 521 SOEs and matched private firms. 97, 2012, long time, 43 countries, 22 industries. This is a cross-country, cross-sector study. We call the SOEs based on ultimate ownership. Use Thomson as our database of patents, inventions. As Saul mentioned, huge problem with homogeneity here, right? Huge problem. So we need to control for that. What we try to do is to have this matched sample using a combination of propensity score matching and constant matching with fixed effects. And a bunch of controls, firm, year, country, year, dummies, even several other controls that are known to affect invention, and a bunch of robustness checks, because even with those things, I mean, unobservable variables may be important. So we vary levels of ownership. We try to run tests for self-selection, omitted variable tests, and so on and so on. So results also real quick. Here we have regressions for the 3 dependent variables, invention, pioneerism, frequency, and impact. Those are our main variables, majority and minority SOEs, majority controlled, minority controlled. I mean, we also run regressions varying the level of ownership. So in general, what you get is that in both cases, as predicted, a positive effect on pioneerism and frequency, both majority and minority. Although if the majority stake of the government increases up to 70% or more, this effect disappears. So it's kind of up to 70% in terms of controlling stakes. Impact, we don't find the negative effect that we predicted, but it still is not significant. I mean, there's no impact of state ownership on impact. And then we run the interactions of institutional variables. Weak political constraints. I mean, if you have a situation with weaker political constraints, you will basically undermine or reduce all those positive effects to the point that if at its maximum value, those positive effects actually disappear. And in terms of the sector level factors, we also have support for that. We use split sample regressions where we compare for each dependent variable, pioneerism, frequency, impact, situations where there's low or high invention productivity. In general, we find that when there is high invention productivity, those negative interactions with institutional variables are less relevant, less significant, suggesting that, I mean, all those risks of political interference may be reduced when SOEs are operating in competitive sectors, more competitive productive sectors, actually. So conclusions, just to conclude, state ownership remains a highly relevant phenomenon. Still, I mean, in academic practice, there's still this argument that, well, those firms cannot compete, but I think we're accumulating evidence that is not the case. I mean, we need to study those firms. The effect of innovation, we think, is more nuanced than initially thought. I mean, there's not only an effect of the institutional environment that we will begin, but also industry conditions. Although the downside of state ownership is credited to this presence of huge agency problems, we actually see kind of the bright side of that in a sense that managers are more autonomous to pursue certain riskier inventions. And of course, we need much more research on the channels that promote this. I mean, can you, for instance, observe what is going on, whether managers are really behaving in a different way? I think there's a lot of opportunity to study those things. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Very tight presentation. I mean, I think in terms, in terms of pulling out what I would like to kick forward to the discussion later on, the addition here in terms of theory to me, I mean, I know there's a lot in this paper, but the addition in terms of theory here is the notion that the enhanced managerial autonomy that we observe in state-owned firms, which until now has been seen as a negative because it allows them, so to speak, to dip their snouts into the trough. In this paper is turned into an advantage because the increased autonomy gives them the ability to undertake innovation that perhaps otherwise they would not. And it also implies much more patience on the side of state owners, state as owner, than you might have from the private sector as owner. And that does have shades of the Mazzucato type of argument, and also of the development state type of argument, the idea that the objectives of the state are perhaps more long-term and more about development. So I thought some real theoretical contributions, and of course a very big empirical contribution in terms of the use of matched sample. Our next presentation is by Aurora. Again, I won't spend very long introducing it. You're going to hear a terrific presentation in a moment. Just to say that we're now moving from a sort of cross-country analysis, cross-country, cross-institutional context to a specific case study. Needless to say, the case study is of China, which is a very good example of when state ownership might generate innovation. It's also, I mean, I don't know how many of you have experience of the UK, but I would have thought the classic example of when state ownership would fail to generate innovation would be looking at the British Railways, an extraordinarily poor area, both in terms of performance and innovation under the state. What's interesting, of course, is that China somehow made state railways work extremely well, and Aurora is going to talk a little bit about why that might be the case. Aurora.
Yep, thank you, Saul, and also thanks to Klaus and the moderators, as well as our participants. Welcome to the webinar. So let me start sharing my screen. So we just heard from Sergio that the state can play a very positive role in the technological innovation in both the developed and emerging economies. So in line with their findings and also some other evidence in the literature, we are looking at specifically the agency problems and managerial autonomy in our context. And we want to take a look at how these problems will make or break SOE innovation, especially in the emerging economies. So our study focuses on this one factor, that is state governance of the firm. So we look at the SOE's, this one type of restructuration program of the SOE in emerging economies, and especially a case analysis in our context. So we want to look at the change in the SOE innovation outputs after the structural changes for their transitioning to a market-driven system in the Chinese high-speed train sector. So first, just some background of the innovation in emerging economies. So the literature compares the advantages between SOEs and POEs. For SOEs, the main advantage comes from the state-backed resources. So the state can provide innovation resources through different means. Most importantly, we have economic and political mechanisms that the state can provide exclusive resources to support the technological innovation of the SOEs. However, we already learned from the literature that too much state interference or involvement in the operation of the SOEs can impair the efficiency of these firms in terms of using the resources to generate outputs, including technological innovation. So on the other hand, for the POEs or privately owned enterprises, innovation is mainly driven by the autonomy and the necessity to strive for success in a very competitive market. So POEs will mostly operate under the market-driven principles to allocate their resources in an optimal way, including their internal R&D, or when they partner with external organizations to create their technological innovation. So the question becomes, is it possible to combine the best of both worlds to create a very efficient type of SOE in terms of generating technological innovation. So can an SOE leverage state-backed resources and operate efficiently in terms of using these resources to follow a market-driven system to achieve superior innovation performance? So this is the motivation of this of our study. So we are looking at the Chinese restructuring program. That is kind of a case illustration of the kind of wider SOE restructuring in the emerging economy. So the main components of the restructuring program include the three main components, which is privatization, that refers to the state is slowly or gradually withdrawing the state-owned equity from the state-owned enterprise. And second is the corporatization. So through the transitioning of a lot of emerging economy, and especially in China, the main purpose of restructuring the SOE is to adapt the organization to a market-driven system. So the third common component is the marketization. So within each restructured SOE, the main purpose is to establish the capitalism or market-driven institutional logics in their internal operations. So here are, I present a table of the detailed changes that happen in the SOE restructuring in the post-reform China. So overall, they are all designed to facilitate the SOE adaptation to the market-driven economy as the country made the transition out of the historic planned economy. So first, the organization's objective is going from an all-inclusive political, social, economic agency to a predominantly economically driven organization. And second, that as I mentioned, through the privatization process, the firm's capital structure changed from a fully state-owned structure to having different portions of state-owned shares. So we have the variations in the mostly private-owned to kind of a mix between private and state-owned capital. So that is in the form of public-private partnerships, so similar to in other economies as well, to other way, restructure SOEs that remained with the majority state-owned capital. And then also what is changed in these state-owned enterprises is their governance structure. So some of these all of these SOEs, they transition from the central planning model, so in which they remain under fully state control, to a hybrid governance structure. So that means some of the restructured SOEs have different degrees of independence from the states. So some remain under full public governance and others become more distant from the state monitoring. And also, a part of the change has to do with the managerial incentives. So now the managers used to pursue mostly political goals in these organizations. After the transition, they're given the autonomy to follow market demands to increase firm profitability, and their performances are evaluated based on the firm's performances. So overall, we expect these changes to have a positive impact on the SOE's innovation. And that is our baseline hypothesis. But in this paper, we're mainly focusing on the difference between state ownership and state affiliation, which represent two forms of firm-state connections. So for these two factors, these two forms of firm-state connections, they're similar in terms of their resource-based effectiveness. So with either ownership-based or affiliation-based connection, the firms can access exclusive innovation networks. So those include the top quality universities with which the firm can partner to learn the cutting edge scientific discoveries and also combine their innovation expertise in conducting the technological invention. These connection with the state also provide to the firm the type of organizational clout and legitimacy, because in the emerging economy context, and especially in the Chinese context, having relationship with the state government is seen as a form of power. And so the firm with the connection to the state can negotiate down prices or costs from the suppliers, and also their buyers or their customers will consider these organizations as being more reliable. So, but these two, so ownership and affiliation, they're different in terms of their institution-based effects. So at the restructured SOE, the firm and also the managers inside the firm undergo this type of hierarchy to market transition that demand them to change their operations and also change their kind of mindset to the historic kind of iron bull driven mindset to the more, you have to be competitive and going where the market is telling you to. So this type of transition. So we expect the institution-based effects from ownership and affiliation to differ, and specifically the restructured SOE that remain in majority state-owned equities inside a firm, they are mostly under the direct governance by the state. So the state is directly involved in the internal operations of these firms, whereas for the state affiliation, their state governance, the public governance is more an arm's length type of governance. So for these firms, the state act as an external monitor to provide guidance or advice on how to operate or how to establish their corporate architecture. So the expected effect is that with the direct governance, the restructured SOE has a less degree of managerial autonomy, but with the arm's length, their autonomy is higher. And in terms of the agency problem, we think both type of public governance can have some sort of effectiveness in curbing the agency problem. So, and also in our context, there are some firms that keep both types of firm-state relationship. So those are the firms that have majority state-owned equities, and they also acquire the formal affiliation status with the state after the restructuration program. So for these firms, we expect two potential scenarios. So one is the direct governance dominates, which would mean the restructuration program on innovation would be less effective. The other possibility is that these firms adopt mainly the arm's length governance types. So for that, if that is the case, then we would expect a bigger improvement in the technological performance after the restructuration. So what we found in the Chinese high-speed train sector is that the evidence suggests that it is true that arm's length governance rather than direct governance is more compatible with the SOE restructuration program, specifically for improving firm innovation. So first, if you look at the top two series, these are the firms with the state affiliation, either with high or low state-owned equities. So these firms have the strongest improvements in the innovation output after their restructuration program. Second, at the bottom two series are the firms without state affiliation. So here, if you look at the middle series here, those are the firms with high state-owned equities, but without the state affiliation status. So these firms, we expect the state governance to remain internal, so the direct governance of the firm. So these firms have not improved much in their innovation. But if you look at the bottom series, these are the firms with low state-owned equities without state affiliation. So these, even though they don't have the resource-based benefits of the firm-state relationship, you can still see the improvement from the restructuring program. So that suggests, autonomy is an important factor here, even without the state interference in the firm's operation. So mainly our findings in terms of theoretical contribution is to distinguish the two forms of state involvement, particularly the type of public governance of the innovative firm. And our findings highlight the complementarity between resource-based and institutional theories in terms of explaining the innovation performance of SOEs in the emerging economies. So in terms of practical contribution, our findings help to explain, why SOE restructuring programs vary in their effectiveness in improving the firm's technological outputs. And our findings suggest that arm's length state governance can potentially be a way to combine the best of both worlds. So giving the firm a level of autonomy and also providing the monitoring mechanism to reduce agency problems, and also allowing the firm to leverage the state-backed resources for their innovation. So as Saul mentioned, that this is a more context-specific study. So in the future, other researchers or we also plan to kind of compare the effects between the strategic sector and non-strategic sectors in China. So high-speed train is a very a typical strategic sector, which the state is giving a lot of heavy resources input to allow the firms to create their own technological innovation. There are other strategic sectors, so that include telecommunication, or the aerospace industry. That's also very high on the list in terms of the Chinese state wanting to promote their technological innovation. So whether these effects we find from the context of the high-speed train sector can generalize to other strategic sectors and maybe also to the non-strategic sectors, that would be an avenue for future studies. And I think it would also be interesting to look at public governance in other emerging economies. So the different SOEs restructuring components would differ across the countries, and also there are different types of firm-state relationships that future studies can take a closer look at. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you a lot, Aurora. Very nice presentation, and once again, thank you for sticking so tightly to the time. I think here we're talking about ways in which changes in agency arrangements in a formal ownership way, but also in terms of connections and networks and relationships, how this affects performance, and seems to conform to the view that improved agency leads to improved performance, which is indeed what one would have hoped, but it's quite nice to see this confirmed. And it is very interesting to hear that we're talking, Aurora's talking about taking the work further on, trying to work out to what extent these ideas are generalizable outside the context of China. And so I think I see quite a few questions have been raised, which we'll no doubt pick up later. We have one more paper here being presented by Pei Sun. And this somewhat slightly changes the focus, because now we've gone from innovation within state-owned firms relative to privatized or semi-privatized firms. We're instead looking at the issue of technological diffusion through M&Es, and the idea that M&Es are moving, say, to emerging markets, and they're setting up joint ventures. And then we're able to get a completely different angle, a different leverage on the question of the performance of SOEs versus POEs in innovation by asking a really simple and clear question, which is, when we look at joint ventures with state-owned firms and compare them with joint ventures with private firms, do we see a difference in the innovative performance? So we're in the same theme, but we're getting it from a very different angle. And Pei, why don't you take it from here?
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's my great pleasure to join this online seminar. So let me share the screen. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a joint work with Professor Ziliang Deng and the late Professor Mike Wright. So definitely this paper is dedicated to the late Professor Mike Wright. He tragically passed away during the paper revision R&R stage. So, but basically, definitely, so all the areas are mine and my co-authors. So as Saul had just mentioned, so we approach this innovation question from another perspective. So actually, that's what we thought about this during the research design process. So we believe that there's so much work being done on the SOE, on the innovation on the part of. So we want to look at, right, the joint ventures between SOEs and multinational firms. We want to look at what happens, right? What happens in these type of organizations, and we try to make some theoretical contributions through that particular angle or context. So basically, you can see that we look at innovation activity within foreign host state joint ventures. So here we look at partnership between two interesting types of organizations: multinational firms from developing and developed countries, and SOEs in the host countries. You can see that it could be from the foreign firm's perspective, right? If you partner with SOEs in host emerging markets, that can be a mixed blessing, right? So on the one hand, right, you can, after the successful partnership, you can get a lot of important resources in the host market, right? You can get access to host market, you can get a lot of political policy resources. But on the other hand, you know that you need to be very careful because you partner with a very powerful animal, political animal, right? Especially in host emerging markets. There can be a lot of misappropriation risks from the conventional transaction cost economics perspective. Move from the foreign perspective to the host country perspective, right? So it's very clear that the host country government, in this case, the Chinese government, want to get technologies from the foreign firms. So they play a game of trading market access for technology. So because you can see, especially in the case of China, the huge market share is one of the most important bargaining powers held by the local and host country government. So we have the very large host country government, host country market. So if you want to get that, okay, please let us have the technology we want. So this is the basic underlying logic between the two partners during this process. So what we want to argue is that in this process, right, we look at two important aspects. The first one is about innovation inputs. The second one is about innovation outputs or innovation performance. So from the foreign firm's perspective, if you follow the traditional or the conventional wisdom transaction cost economics, right, you should be very protective in terms of making innovation inputs in the joint ventures, right? Because you know beforehand, you know that, right, the host country governments and the associated SOEs, they are opportunistic, they're very opportunistic. So you need to be super careful about this process, right? So if we strictly follow the conventional wisdom TCE, transitional cost economics, so you would expect that the innovation inputs in these types of joint ventures will be very limited, right? So, but our major finding, the first finding is just the opposite. What we have found is that innovation inputs in this type of joint ventures very significant. They are significantly larger than their counterparts, i.e. Foreign private joint ventures. And in this process, we argue basically the major finding one is that so the host country ownership leads to more R&D investment, innovation inputs in IJVs, in spite of underlying transactional, political hazard. So this is the first findings we found, and we argue that the more intensive innovation inputs in this case are politically motivated and could be symbolically managed to ensure the continued resource exchange process between the two parties. So basically our argument is that the multinational firms need to access to the market, the huge market in the domestic market. They need some important resources, financial resources, policy resources, political resources from their political partner. So they need to sacrifice, right, this kind of thing. So they make important R&D commitments, right, with the political partner to ensure that they get the resources, the requisite resources in return. So that's basically our argument. So in this case, it's slightly different from the traditional TCE argument. So in this case, because we want to maximize the transaction value, so we do not necessarily minimize the transaction cost, right? So in this particular case, transaction cost is not minimized because we want to enlarge the greater pie, right, to pursue a higher level of transaction value. And to check whether the underlying mechanism is correct, we look at three moderators in this context, right? We found that this positive impact of state ownership on R&D investment can be weakened when the following three conditions are met. The first is that if the multinationals can directly transfer their technology from the home country, then this political pressure of R&D investment will be mitigated because you directly transfer your established technology to the joint venture. The second one is that if the joint venture has a lower level of dependence on host country government, so if the IJV is more or export oriented, so this means that they do not terribly need this kind of domestic political resources, then this political pressure of R&D will be weakened. And thirdly, if the IJV is located in a relatively deregulated region, so in the sense that the government power is not that dramatic, then we can find that the political pressure of R&D, i.e. the positive effect of government ownership on R&D investment within IJV will be weakened. So basically, that's our first major finding. So hopefully you'll get the full paper. So in this presentation, I'm not going to go to the technical details. So the first major finding is that innovation inputs can be politically motivated and for the foreign companies to get access to political resources. And our second major finding is that if we look at the innovation outputs measured by patents data, and we will find that compared with foreign private IJVs, unfortunately, foreign host state JVs do not perform that well. So we look at the applications, and we also look at the patents eventually granted by the state authority. So we look at the two indicators. So what we found is that, right, basically, although R&D investments are greater within the foreign host state IJVs, their innovation outcomes are not that impressive. And we argue that is simply because of the agency problem within about IJV, about ISOE partners. And here I want to echo Sergio's argument about managerial autonomy. So basically, in the first presentation, we have heard that because of the managerial autonomy, so potentially SOEs can be more innovative. So my reflection here is that autonomy definitely is a necessary condition for potentially higher innovation performance, but I'm not quite sure whether managerial autonomy would be a sufficient condition for innovation, higher innovation performance. Because if you have higher innovation autonomy, so you can decide whether to make inputs in innovation or any other activities. And here in this context, in this IJV context, right, because SOE partners can have a very happy life with these multinationals, they can, it's a very nice win-win combination. You know, multinationals have advanced technology and the product, and SOEs have domestic support, you have a political resources, so they lead a happy life. But because of the happy life, right, even if they have autonomy, they are not pressured to make fundamental advancement in technology. So it's basically, that's our argument to explain the underperformance in these kind of organizations. Okay, so the implication of our funding suggests that first, we want to underline the importance of seemingly market actions that can be actually potentially symbolic and political. So in a foreign market, in emerging markets, so firms can have market actions that are inherently political to secure the interests of country political institutions. And the second implication is that maybe we should not necessarily follow the traditional implication from TCE. So because sometimes we want to leverage inherent risky things. So we not necessarily minimize the risk, because sometimes we take the risk because there can be potential benefits from this kind of risky activities, like R&D activities. And thirdly, we want to make a subtle distinction between two dimensions of the local partners. The first one is powerfulness, and the second one is dangerousness. In the case of SOEs in host country, so SOEs can be very powerful, but they're not necessarily the most dangerous partners. So from the multinationals perspective, so for example, if you're a partner like Huawei, right, they're private, it is private, right? And it's also politically connected, and also it has very strong entrepreneurial spirits. So that could be the most dangerous, right, players in the host country market. On the other hand, if you have very strong, very powerful SOE, it's not necessarily the most dangerous one, because they do not have that kind of strong pressure right into innovation activities. Okay, so in terms of future research, we are thinking about three broad areas. The first one is about innovation research. Because our paper is submitted to a special issue on innovation in emerging market. So we think that we need more research on the political institutional dimensions of corporate innovation, both in emerging markets and in developed market perspective. And the second, it seems that we have very few studies about innovation within IJVs, because here we are not talking about R&D consortia. We're not talking about innovation consortia. We're talking about the general normal IJVs. So we don't see a lot of important studies there. And the second direction could be to look at MNE host government bargaining literature, because traditional study of this in this area is about the misappropriation of assets, of the physical assets, right? The traditional TCE story, because you have sunk costs, you have sunk investment, so there can be some very important hold up problem in the, in views of the traditional Oliver Williamson stuff, right? Of the opportunism of this kind of stuff. But here we look at intangible assets. We look at ideas, skills, technologies. So these kind of things are not necessarily sunk, right? It could be sunk, it could be not. So in that case, what was the implication of this kind of dynamics in terms of bargaining, right, with regard to this kind of assets? I think that's a very important issue to look at. And finally, in terms of state capitalism research, I strongly agree that the state can be very powerful, can be very effective in some areas, and the state can also be very ineffective, very inefficient in some other areas. We need to look at all these issues and to identify the areas, the aspects of activities the state is particularly good at and particularly bad at. Thank you very much.
Saul, you're muted.
Thank you very much. I won't comment further on the presentation. I'm just going to, because I think everyone has a lot of questions that people have got, and I think everyone wants to hold the feet of the speakers to the hot fire. And the way this seems to work is people put in questions and I try and collate them. I'm going to organize the questions in terms, first of all, of questions about theory. Then though Klaus has told me I'm not really meant to, there are some questions that come up on methods. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to, at this time, no one really talked much about policy implications in the presentations. And I am going to ask each of the panelists at this time at the end to comment on policy implications. Let's start with the first question on, I'm asking questions. I've tried to put together questions that all three of you can answer one after the other, choose your own order. Okay, so I think the first question is a lot of people are very interested in how you see market conditions, market structure, and in particular the role of competition. How in the particular framework that you're analyzing do you see competition? I mean, there's this very important paper going back, I think, to 1990s by Steve Nichol, that essentially pinned down empirically that at least in advanced economies, the key driver of innovation is competition. It wasn't a word much used in any of your papers, and obviously you're looking at slightly different things. So I just wondered if competition in any way fitted any of your work or was relevant to your thinking. Sergio, do you want to kick off with that? Yours is the most general of the papers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Saul. Thanks for the question. Yeah, no, it's very important in our context. I mean, the condition we call invention productivity is a condition, basically we interpret that as an increase in the need of firms to be productive, where in industries where there's high intensity of invention, right? And an example is Brazil's Embraer. Even though the Brazilian government was intervening in many SOEs in Embraer, actually in the aircraft industry, the government didn't mess much with the company, right? And if you will, just a comment on what Pei said. So Pei, I mean, our argument is not that autonomy is a sufficient condition. Actually, it's far from that. We are just saying that it's a condition that is moderated by a lot of things, including this competition effect. Thanks.
Aurora, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question from the audience. So definitely competition is a major factor. And in terms of how competition affects innovation in our context, it's a double-edged sword, sorry. So on the one hand, competition creates the necessity for the firms to innovate because they want to offer superior products to the market to be competitive. On the other hand, competition also can have a negative impact on innovation because these firms, they need to collaborate with the other, the firms need to collaborate among themselves in order to have the type of innovation output that can kind of be satisfactory to the market's demand. So in our context, collaboration is a big component for the firms to conduct their R&D for both learning purposes and also for resource combination. So competition, it's important, but it's kind of the impact is not necessarily clear. And for our sample, these firms, they are all they have different degrees of state-owned equities of these firms, but none of them is kind of truly privately owned enterprise. So the competition is in part mitigated by the state's interference in this whole context. And I also saw that some of the other participants are commenting on, you know, the component of technology transfer in the high-speed train sector. So it is true that in the early stage of domestic innovation, a big cornerstone for these firms to pursue patents and also technological output is through transferring foreign inventions by establishing these international joint venture between the state-owned enterprise and the multinational enterprise coming into the Chinese market. So for this form of joint venture, you can see that their main target is to gain access to the domestic market in China, and they're not particularly incentivized to create their own unique technology in China. But what ends up happening is that by using the transferred technology from this partnership, a lot of the state-owned enterprise, so the parent firm of these joint ventures, end up kind of in part through reverse engineering and to improve upon these existing technology, and they end up having you know, the train technology that can achieve a higher speed. And that's also another question regarding, other than patents, how you measure the innovation in the high-speed train sector. So one way to look at the innovation output is the level of speed that these trains can achieve. And so, you know, arguably some of these Chinese generated technologies have surpassed the original technological foundation that they base their invention on.
Thank you, Aurora. Pei?
Okay, yes. My feedback, my response will be short. So basically, in this paper, because our sample does not involve any purely domestic firms or for 100% foreign subsidiaries. So we do not discuss anything about the competition between IJVs and the other types of firms. So we only look at the sample at IJV. So if you have the paper, if you look at table 1, you will find that foreign states, foreign host state JVs perform much better than foreign private firms in many aspects, in terms of financial performance, in income tax, in terms of the market share. So basically, you can see that the foreign host state JVs have a very happy life in China because they have the best of both. But the interesting is that simply because of their happy life, their innovation performance is not that significant. So we look at, in this case, you can see that we look at the potential competition between foreign host state JVs and foreign private JVs. So this is the one dimension of competition. The second dimension is about inter-partner competition, but definitely this can be another issue. So inter-partner competition is something between the foreign partner and the domestic partner, but definitely another issue in relation to the market competition in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second question on the theoretical side. I tried to merge questions together to capture all of your arguments. It's really all about the issue of the impact of institutional arrangements. And I think people are interested in how are your results about the relationship between innovation, state ownership and innovation? How are they impacted by institutional arrangements? For example, the specific systems of control of governance, or as another example, the particular political system arrangements. In other, this is an issue of generalizability. Would results easily travel from one type of political system to a second? And a third example of institutional arrangements would be about in China, whether your ownership is in the hands of the state or in the hands of the province. So to speak, the level of political control. So I think everyone's asking for a little bit more information or more on your views on the moderating, if that's how you see it, on the moderating impact of institutions on the underlying relationship you're analyzing. Do you want to kick off, Aurora?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So that's a very good question. So particularly in our context, there is a tier system, both in ownership and affiliations. So a firm can be owned, well, in terms of majority state or public equity, and also affiliation directly with the state, or also with a provincial level or a municipal level. So we do expect these effects to differ because from the theory side, the state has these central position in the country in terms of establishing the political system and also organizing or coordinating the economic system in the country. So we certainly expect the direct affiliated or directly owned by the state SOEs to outperform the provincial level and municipal level affiliation and state-owned firms. But these kind of evidence is not very apparent from our sample. And a potential explanation is that because this is a very strictly controlled sector in China. So like I mentioned, it's one of the key strategic sectors in China. In these strategic sectors, the state government has a very clear objective to foster domestic technological innovation. So under that principle, the state government and the different tiers governments coordinate quite tightly in terms of allocating the innovation resources and also maintaining the national and local innovation network in which the firms and public organizations collaborate for their innovation. So I think that could be the explanation why the different tiers government relationships will not have that big a difference in the innovation outcomes from our sample.
Thank you. Pei, do you want to go next?
Yes. You know, when we talk about SOE, so we have a huge literature on agency theory, right, to explain the SOE's behaviors, activities. But according to a famous management scholar, agency theory is highly under-contextualized. It's a very under-contextualized theory. So we need to understand the institutional context, right? Institutional context give us more instruction to how to identify the objectives, incentives, the principles, and agents. So I think that's how institutional context, institutional conditions come in, right, in this dialogue. And in my paper, in this current paper, I think the institutional context is very important because they need to understand the objectives of Chinese government and objectives of multinationals, right, to understand the underlying resource exchange, favor exchange process. And the institutional context in China is also very important because China has a luxury to use a large market as a bargaining power. So this argument definitely doesn't make any sense in a small host country, right? Because in that country, they do not have this kind of bargaining power. They may have some other bargaining powers. So basically, all these kind of discussion needs to be very, dependent upon the institutional context we're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sergio, do you want to?
Yeah, real quick. I mean, the institutional environment is key to our theorizing. I mean, we use this concept of weak political constraints, meaning that the government is free to intervene, but we don't dig deeper into the mechanisms that will create constraints. So, for instance, there may be some sort of constitutional provisions, legal provisions, or even agencies, regulatory agencies. I mean, I have another line of research that I have is public-private partnerships. We know that in that literature, for instance, that even in countries with weak institutional development, if you have PPP units that are created to generate this kind of contractual safety and regulatory stability, then this may help. In the case of SOEs, I mean, we still need more research along those lines. I think it's a very fruitful research and can help give very practical recommendations for the management of the SOEs.
Thank you, Sergio. I've got another sort of question that captures you all. It's a little bit, well, it's a bit of a difficult question, but I'm interested in whether you think that the innovation that we're seeing in these emerging economies is truly innovative. I mean, this is really both a conceptual question about the relationship between technological diffusion, adaptation, and innovation. So it's partly a conceptual question. It's also a measurement question. Pei, for example, is using measures of both basically inputs and outputs, right, in a sort of knowledge production function sense, and he gets different results depending on whether you measure inputs or outputs, which is in some vague sense worrying. And then there've been quite a few questions essentially about the technology and whether the technology is domestic or foreign, and the role of foreign technology in high-speed railways in China, which Aurora has already begun to talk about. So the question I've got for you all, and this time I'll kick off with Pei, is about whether we're correctly measuring the notion of innovation in these studies, and whether and how future work might consider developing our approaches to measurement of innovation.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Basically, first I want to say that unfortunately I'm not an innovation scholar, so I leverage the institutional aspect, right, to study innovation. So definitely I'm not an expert on this. So broadly speaking, if you look at innovation, basically you have three types of innovation. You have product innovation, you have process innovation, and your business model innovation. So definitely, in all of our papers, we don't talk about business model innovation. That's totally another thing, because definitely you can never use patents, right? Patents to look at this kind of thing. So so I think here we look at process or more broadly the product innovation stuff. I think in our paper, definitely, I think the measurement is a bit crude. So because if you look at the innovation scholarship, the literature in innovation scholarship, if you look at the frontier literature, definitely you do not only measure the number of the invention patents, you look at the impact, you have the citation. And recently I have some communication with innovation scholars. They have developed very sophisticated methods to measure the quality of innovation. So it's just like our papers. We publish papers. You can never count the number of your papers you publish. Sometimes you look at citation, but citation again, right, is not that informative. So you look at more sophisticated. So for example, you look at whether the impact, the citation, will be impactful in other areas. So in other related aspects. So basically, if we go to innovation literature, definitely we can find more sophisticated nuance measurements of the quality of innovation. And in our paper, we look at the R&D inputs of these cases. Basically, our argument is that so these innovation inputs can be partially political. So they're not real innovation, right? They can be strategically managed, right, to address some political pressures. So thank you. That's my response.
Sergio?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I mean, I agree with Pei. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to move beyond the traditional patent measures. Building, and somebody mentioned in the chat the work by Mariana Mazzucato, so basically she argues that the state can generate spillovers. So we're not actually measuring those spillovers. We had an idea, but we still didn't implement it yet, which is to see whether other firms are using those patents generated by state-owned enterprises, citing those patents. This, of course, connects with this literature on grading and development, right? I mean, we can also talk about the types of sectors. There's a whole debate of whether in emerging markets we have more research related to commodity sectors versus more technologically advanced. I mean, several ways to improve this discussion.
Thank you. Aurora?
Yeah, so I think there are many alternative ways to measure innovation output. And so, like Pei mentioned, innovation, if you look at it from a conceptual standpoint, you can look at technological or product innovation as opposed to business model innovation. And specifically for technological innovation, even if you just focus on patent data, there are a lot of different metrics that reflect the quality of the contents of the patent itself. So for example, if you don't want to just count the number of applications or the number of successful patent grants, you can look at how each patent is related to the other patents through citation, not necessarily just the citation count, but the citation-based knowledge network. So there is a type of metrics that is based on the knowledge network constructed from the citation of different patents, and that measure the disruptiveness of the patent. Or you could look at the measures using the text mining techniques to look at the similarity between patents, and that can reflect the novelty of the patent. So that could give you some alternative measures to look at the quality of the technological innovation output. And if you look at technological innovation more from a new product perspective, that you have to kind of pick your industry focus, because products across the industry would be more difficult to compare. But if you have an industry focus, you can look at industry-specific product metrics. So for example, in our context, the high-speed train, you can look at the maximum speed each new train line can reach to be a measure for the innovation quality. Thank you.
Thank you. A very interesting answer. And it does show us that though these papers are great, we're sort of scratching the surface, really, of measuring innovation when we're thinking about the relationship between innovation, performance, and ownership. And there are a lot deeper and more contextualized, as Pei says, ways to go. I'd like to. I'm hoping Klaus isn't going to just turn my microphone off, and he'll just give me a couple of minutes more, because I would like to ask each of the speakers to comment on the policy implications of their work. In their final slides, they all gave really very interesting ideas of how their work affects existing knowledge and how research would be taken forward. But I think it would be very interesting to know what they think, whether their work has policy implications, and if so, what they might be. And this time, maybe we'll start again with Sergio.
Thank you. Very difficult question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
End with a bang, eh?
But for instance, we had here in Brazil, we're having discussions about the privatization of state-owned enterprises, and our results actually show that there's this effect of an improvement in institutional conditions. We had some discussions here on new legislation to kind of create a buffer against political interference. So before talking about privatization could be an option, but you could also have this alternative route. And also, given our effect on the effect that we detected on productivity, so another way is actually to integrate those state-owned enterprises in markets where they compete, and especially when you have sectors that are more productive. This will may naturally be a way to actually create constraints for politicians to intervene strongly, because they know that that eventually this will undermine the competitiveness of the firm.
Thank you. Aurora?
Yeah, so our study, the focus of our study in this presentation is about public governance. So we show that there, in terms of public governance of the firm, you really have to balance between autonomy and monitoring. So on the one hand, you want the firm to have a sufficient degree of autonomy so that they can pursue innovation as they see fit. On the other hand, you want the effective monitoring mechanism to be in place so that you curb the agency problems inherent in the state-owned enterprise even after the structuration. So I think in terms of the policy implication going forward, even nowadays in China, a lot of the policies have to do with, how much state control of a particular industry or of the state-owned enterprises should there be. And I think it may not just be restricted to state-owned enterprise. It could also have policy implications for how the state government would regulate the operations of private enterprise. So one kind of pretty significant case that is in the recent news is the potential IPO of the Ant Group in China. So that was supposed to be a pretty big IPO success in China, but there were some political kind of misalignment between the CEO's the Jack Ma's view as opposed to what the government thinks the banking industry or the financial industry overall should be regulated in the country, and that kind of created some difficulty for the IPO going forward currently. So I think the balance between autonomy and control or monitoring in the public governance system should kind of be more scrutinized moving forward.
Great. Difficult question, very, very stimulating answers. I feel we all know a lot more now than we did before we started an hour and 23 minutes ago about innovation by state-owned firms. And I'd like to thank all three presenters and the many questions for helping us with all of that. If I can just say, I mean, both Klaus and I came into all of this sort of thinking, well, state-owned firms won't innovate and can't innovate. When I say came into it, I mean in the 1990s or whatever, a long time ago, that was our view, right? And so obviously the question you've got to ask is, well, we were wrong. Why were we wrong? And one reason is, of course, that governance of state-owned firms has improved very much, partly because of changes in ownership and improvements as a result of them being partially owned and restructured, partly because institutions have improved, particularly institutions related to governance, partly because the policy environment has altered to change what governments are trying to do with their state-owned firms. There may also be, although none of the papers tested it, I was very interested in Sergio's point because I've been thinking about the same thing, testing the Mazzucato type spillover effects. Maybe there is really something to that. I mean, maybe what's really important in China is not only is that the state has played such a big role in building infrastructure and building external connections that enables innovation far more. So that's a Mazzucato type effect. And finally, Sergio argued in favor of a sort of the state ownership having leading to a longer term perspective, a longer term view. and giving management autonomy to exploit that. We didn't talk much about resources and whether the state funnels resources. You see, it is possible that state-owned firms innovate much more, but they're terrifically wasteful. I mean, that's sort of hinted at in Pei's results. But nonetheless, good work is always in the form that you learn something and you're left with lots of questions, and that's exactly where I feel we are, as I now hand back to Klaus.
Thank you very much, Saul. That was already an excellent summary, so there's very little for me to say. There's just one line of thought I'd like to bring up. Pei mentioned that along the way, and that is the way we operationalize innovation. In the research we do, including the papers here, we often focus on patents. But what I see when I was in China is a lot of innovation that is on the very applied side. It is in the business model innovation, and possibly marginal improvements in technologies that are not necessarily patentable. And therefore, a lot of what's happening in emerging markets may not be really captured very well by focusing on patents, which is very suitable for certain industries such as pharmaceuticals, which for the other reasons, with the current race for a COVID vaccine and so on, we focus a lot on that. In that sector, patents are important. In other sectors, the sectors that are important in emerging markets, maybe we need to think more about how we operationalize or how we think about innovation. That's the outcome variable today. Okay, with that, it remains to me to say thank you for Saul for stimulating discussion. Thank you for presenters for your presentations and your thoughtful answers to the questions, and to the audience for your questions. All the papers that we talked about today are available on the JIP's website under Advanced Online. In due course, a recording of this webinar along with the PowerPoints will be available on the AIB website. And we will meet again in another webinar in due course, probably in January. The topics we're currently working on is something in international marketing. And of course, we're going to have something on cross-cultural teams, which will be stimulated by the Decade Award that was given to a paper by Martha Masniewski, Günter Stahl, and others. And we will have them reflect over their work, and the commentator will join that. That's probably going to be in mid-January. And with that, thank you everyone for your contributions.